Welcome back to Tiny Grimes Games, and I'm here with another Star Wars Destiny video. And we are in the middle of regional season, knee deep, and I thought it would be a good idea to get a meta examination video out before this weekend. What I think is really fascinating about this meta is that it has reached a point after a few weeks where people are pretty sure that it is defined. If it is defined, that means a lot because you can start to see what the meta is, plan your deck to beat the meta. What's interesting to me is I feel like the meta is not as defined as we think. And here's why. When you look around at what has been winning lately, I think it's important to look at the names of the people that are winning. And they are the people you would expect is the bottom line. When I look around the top fours at most of the major events, I'm looking at them and going, Yep, okay, these are the people I expect to be in the finals and the top four win. And so my question is the meta is it just a skill-based meta? In other words, where it's such an open meta that good players are winning, ergo, whatever decks good players are taking and winning with are defining the meta? Or are the meta decks being found by the good players faster? And I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I tend to lean towards I think skilled players are just winning right now in this early, more open meta. A really good example of this to me is the New Jersey meta. Last weekend you had Joe and Mike end up in the finals. And if you would have said, hey Tiny, who's going to be in the finals of that tournament? I would have said Joe and Mike. And if you had said, all right, put them on a deck, I would have said whatever they want, they end up in the finals. That would be my assumption. And sure enough, they both brought decks that they thought battled the meta, but weren't like the thought to be top meta decks going in. Joe brought a one-turn kill deck, and Mike brought Sabine Ezra, both of which put up good results. Mike did start 1 and 2, which I feel like puts a little bit of a damper on the success of his deck and more on his skill level. But someone else was able to win another regional with Sabine Ezra, kind of giving it that push that maybe that is just a top tier deck, and that's just a fact. But it's really interesting to me, especially a one-turn kill deck. I don't consider that to be a top meta deck, but I also do consider whatever Joe brings to have a very good chance of winning. I think the same is true if you look the week before at, say, the SoCal Regional, which if you had asked me at the start of the tournament, what are the 4 best players that are at this tournament? In my opinion, those 4 players all made the top 4. And if you look at those decks, it's 2 Mother Talzin Kylo decks, a Kenobi Maz deck, and a Vehicles deck. And I'm not sure you would say, oh, that's the meta. Those are the best decks. I feel like, again, that was a situation where the 4 best players did well in their event, and those were the decks they happened to bring. So again, I feel like we are reaching a point where when you look at the results, they have been consistent enough where we are seeing a meta developing. But my point is, I think there's a lot of room for innovation still within this meta. And I think that it's not as defined as we think it is, because it's real easy to fall into the trap of what won last week. All right, I'm going to play that. That must be the best deck, without really seeing like, oh, that was the best player of that tournament. In a skill-based game, the best player in the tournament should win. Now, they'll have an easier time winning if they make the best deck decision they can, but in a skill-based game where it looks like Destiny is right now, having the best deck is great, but having the most skill is even better. All right, well, so let's take a look at what decks have been winning and what you need to be on the lookout for. So I'd say really where we are is a bit of a rock, paper, scissors scenario where we have vehicle decks that run 3 characters, high health, and are able to get to an overwhelming board state relatively quickly, and then just overwhelm you from there is one of sort of the pillars of the meta. The reason is they have high health, they usually have a lot of shields, and then they're still putting out tons of damage. And then you have kind of the opposite end of the spectrum of that, the mill decks that are doing something similar in that they have high health, shields, And while that's always been a good way to go about your business, it was never quite fast enough. But now these decks seem to have reached this apex where they can mill you out very quickly. So it's able to be a reaction to those vehicle decks that are very hard to kill because they hang around a long time. Well, the mill deck says, I don't care, I don't have to kill you, and you're not going to have forever to reach your overwhelming board state because I don't have to go through all that health. Therefore, I'm going to be able to mill you out. And then you have more bursty decks that are able to kind of take advantage of the slower status of either the mill or vehicle deck. Sabine Ezra being one of the best examples of this. And we saw that last weekend in a meta where people thought vehicles and mill would be prevalent. Bursty decks had great success. So it's an interesting question of, again, did they have great success because they preyed upon these slower decks, or did they have great success because Jem and his protege won events, right? It's like, I'm not entirely sure. We do have some other contenders, though, for top decks. Certainly, I think Kylo Mother Talzin kind of enters the rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock scenario, where that is able to go after a mono deck like Sabine Ezra. We may see Sabine Yoda instead as sort of a reaction then to the reaction of Kylo Talzin being pretty decent against a Sabine deck. And then you also have these Hondo X decks lurking around, which can be kind of bursty and certainly crush unfamiliar players. The thing with Hondo is we're going to see Hondo decks do well because they just beat inexperienced players. So in these big regionals right now, where you have maybe half the field that's not a like super high level competitive Destiny player, that's like 4 free wins right there. It gets 2 more wins at 6-2 and it's making cuts. So I'm not saying Hondo decks are bad. What I'm saying is I feel like it's hard to get a full range of evidence on them. From my own personal evidence, I don't think they're good. I think it's pretty easy to play around Hondo. But I do know skilled players that swear by Hondo being amazing, and it's just that the early versions were bad, and now that we are fine-tuning these decks, it doesn't matter that you know the, quote, gimmick. It still is really effective. So these are all good decks you should be aware of. If you're building a gauntlet, you definitely need to, like, whatever deck you're bringing, it needs to be bursty enough to pop through mill and vehicle decks, or have a way to handle them. Like, I don't feel like Kylo Mother Talzin is especially bursty, but my build had Force Rend, which allowed me to beat mill pretty handily. A deck can throw Vandalize in to handle C-3PO and have a good plan and probably be okay against mill. But you need to have some way to get around that, and then you need to be able to handle Sabine Ezra. You need to, like, especially if they God roll you, you may just have to go, good game, sir. Hats off to you. Well done, or well rolled, either one, depending on how salty you want to be in your goodbye. But you do need to be able to beat them relatively quickly. If you give Sabine 3-4 turns at you, she's going to kill all your guys. Like, you can't complain if Sabine gets 4 rolls. They win. So you need a way to take her off the board. I think, though, like I said at the top, that this meta, while defined, I'm not sure it's accurately defined, right? I think it might just be defined because people want to gravitate towards what's winning, and good players are winning, and therefore those decks become the decks. I still think there's an Ayla deck that is the best deck in the meta. And you can say, hello, Tiny, there's the Ayla vehicle deck. But what I mean is a deck that's really more built around Ayla and having, like, at least 2, if maybe not 3 reasonable characters that are doing damage that's not based around vehicles and is a little faster than that, and really just based on, like, being a bursty deck. A good example of this is Ayla Padawans. I was playing this for a little while. It won a really early regional before there was any data, so I don't really know what to do with that. But in my own testing, I found it to be very good. I almost brought it to my own regional. The only problem is it's a little dicey because it can get bursted down. And then on top of that, if it's a Kylo Talzin meta, then it's really dicey. And that's the main reason I didn't bring it, as I was kind of like putting my feelers out. It felt to me like Kylo Talzin was going to be popular, And though 2 made the final 4, and there were like 4 in the top tables of like the top 12 people, outside of that, no one was playing it. So it was one of those weird things, again, of like all the most skilled, not all the most skilled, but several of the top skilled players were playing this deck. So I don't know what that means, right? Does that mean it is then one of the best decks in the meta that's kind of under the radar? Or does it just mean skilled players are winning? So I feel like the next couple weeks are really going to help define this meta for us. We'll just have to see from there. And I guess one more thing to kind of like give a little more credence to this skill scenario is when there was the Pol Maz meta, I'm not trying to be rude to anyone. Everyone who plays Destiny, I'm sure, is a skilled player to some degree. What I mean is, I played a lot of people on TTS, I played a lot of people in person, and I know for a fact that there were many people making cuts with Pol Maz that I would not say were the best 4 people at their store championship. That takes nothing away from them. They chose a very good deck for that meta, but the point is, that's not what I'm seeing right now. I'm not seeing cuts where I'm like, wow, like that person made it over those 2 people who are more skilled generally when the meta is a skill meta. So last thing, the skill meta, it's open, be creative, but be ready for the meta decks I talked about. Don't get stopped by them, don't be surprised by them. They'll be there, but there is still room to innovate. Do the innovation, and yeah, hit me up, let me know. I innovated there, Tiny. Look at that, it was amazing. I'll see you next time on Tony Grams Games.